Well, I'll tell you the difference between me and George Soros. It's not so much that we can both look ahead and see the future. The difference between me and him is that he gets there a few days earlier than I do. Right. And that makes all the difference. It really does. If you can get there a couple of days quicker than the rest of the market, you're going to capture like 80-90% of the returns. So even though when I sit down and do my brokeronomics, I think that I'm, putting out the right stuff about, where we're going. To be fair, if I could run that same thought process by looking at a news article and get there within half an hour and then place a trade, to be fair, I'd probably be running one of the world's largest hedge funds. It's not so much the destination. It's how quickly you get there.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, that's why great traders on all sorts of things, not just the money markets, not just foreign currencies, but anything really, equities or commodities or anything, they find a bit of news or a new bit of information and sort of immediately calculate what that means for the price.
I can give you a really good example. there was one fantastic, I can't remember the name of the chap now, it'll come to me in a minute, but do you remember when those 4G licenses came out, when government started auctioning off 4G, the thing on your phone, which we're moving away now to 5G, but 4G licenses came out whenever it was like 15 years ago, and the UK government decided that they, instead of just selling them, they were going to auction them to the highest bidder. Now, that news came out, and one hedge fund manager, he looked at that and he thought, hang on a minute, all of these phone companies, they are going to have to, the game incentives is they have to bid up to the highest level that they possibly can. All of these companies are running with massive debt. They don't have big cash piles. It's going to basically bankrupt the telecoms industry. So he saw that news article and, within the space of an afternoon, he figured out the downstream effects of it, and he was shorting the telecoms industry. He made an absolute fortune. Now, again, I would have got there eventually, but I wouldn't have got it the same afternoon as the news came out, and that's why he's running a hedge fund worth many hundreds of billions. So yeah, that the ability to see and the speed of it is what makes a difference, and Soros was brilliant at that.
Yeah. There's few people that can do it. So, for example, where I mentioned is, and it's in an indirect sense, it was John Major against Soros. It's much more than that. But...
So politicians, they are so far down.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
The ability to do this stuff.
That was the point I was going to make. Yeah.
They're not even playing the same sport.
Yeah, in that battle of abilities to see into the future, John Major was absolutely outclassed by not just Soros, but all sorts of fund managers, all sorts of people that are in the money markets at that time. Yeah. He was way, way, way behind. I think John Major, just to say this, to get it out there, I think he's extremely dull-witted. I think he's a dull-witted person. I'd even go so far as to say he's almost stupid. Some of the decisions he makes in this, when we go through it, it's going to be like, why did you think that, John? Sorry, Sir John, sorry. Yeah. He's a Knight of the Garter, isn't he?
Yeah.
What made you think that, John? Like, why haven't you changed your mind now this new bit of information's come out? Explain yourself.
I mean, the skill set and incentives of politicians is just completely different. If you're a trader...
That is the answer, isn't it? There's that.
Yeah, if you're a trader, you need to have strong convictions, but they must be very loosely held. You must abandon those convictions on the drop of a hat. Otherwise, you're going to lose all of your money. But politicians, because it's not their own money they're spending, it's taxpayers' money, they can be pig-headed. And actually, most of the time it works because there's always more taxpayers' money, or they can print it. They can get away with it. And actually, one of the lessons perhaps from this day is perhaps if he had been even more pig-headed, he might have been able to get through it. Maybe if they just kept on firing the billions at it and they just didn't care what it costs, eventually they could have beaten the market. You said it, but yeah, I mean, Japan has done this for years. That they have taken. I mean, every so often you get a George Soros type who thinks I'm going to take on the Bank of Japan, and I'm going to break their yield curve control. Every time it's a we don't make a trade because they just like, nope, we are not moving. Whereas possibly to their credit, they realised that they were on a hiding to nothing on this one and they let it go. But they could have kept on firing billions and billions at it, and maybe maybe the government's policy could have remained irrational for longer than the traders could have remained solvent.
Maybe.
It's difficult to know.
I mean, I don't think the Bank of England definitely didn't have an endless reserve of foreign currency. Because if you're going to buy a pound, if you're going to buy sterling, you have to do it with either gold or just other foreign currencies you've got. Yeah. So we had a finite amount of dollars and yen mainly. Yeah. Anyway.
I mean, you could have got creative with I don't know, something like if they had swap lines back then to another.
If you really wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying they could have done, but at least they let it go when they did.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah. Yeah. Should we get into the detail of it then? So what happened? So the day, Black Wednesday, is the 16th of September 1992. And basically, the pound lost a great deal of its value on that day. That's basically the story. But I want to go back.
Yeah, you need to start with the ERM, don't you?
Yeah. So the story is really about Europe and about the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism. So I want to go back to, just very briefly, just a few minutes really, just talk about some of the earlier things that happened in the European project of unification, and sort of the, very broadly speaking, the economy of the 70s and 80s. So now we've got like the EU, haven't we? But that wasn't sort of formally come about until the Maastricht Treaty, which is like, 1992. So before that, and even now, there's many layers of...
Was it still the EEC?
It was the EEC then,
right, the European Economic Community.
That's it, right.
So it was more of an economic club than
a
well, I mean, it was a political project, but nothing like what it is today.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a few different layers of it, isn't there? There's sort of the European Council, and there's all sorts of things, the Schengen zone. Nowadays, I mean, there's all sorts of sort of layers and levels to the governance and bureaucracy to it. But there was less of it back then. But John Major signed the Maastricht Treaty in, I think, 1992. It was just a little bit before this.
I mean, it was Thatcher who took us into the ERM, wasn't it? But John Major was Chancellor while Thatcher was Prime Minister, and Thatcher was resolutely against it. But Major just wore her down and eventually got her, against her better judgment, to go into the ERM. And I think that was about 2 years before. That'd be about 1990.
Yeah. It was just before she left office, which was, if I remember correctly, it's right at the end of 1990 or the very beginning of 1991. Right. It's about then. I think the very end of 1990 is when Major replaced Thatcher. So just to say ever so quickly then that the European project to become a sort of super state. One thing I would say, it's a bit of my opinion. Some people might be able to argue that what I'm about to say is wrong, but I think the project was always to be a full super state. I think, even in Brexit in 2016, some Remainers would try and make the argument that, no, that's not what it is. That's not. I don't think that argument is remotely credible. I don't think probably in many other countries they'd even try to make that argument.
Oh yeah,
like in France, they don't even try to make that argument. I don't think.
Yeah, no. For a lot of people, it's always been about the superstate.
Yeah, right.
They've just been, relatively careful not to make those arguments in English on English news channels.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's like that guy who's active now, Guy Verhofstadt, who's always speaking on these things. He has never made any bones about the fact that it is a European superstate that he is driving towards, and not for this podcast, but then there's the whole world government agenda that has sort of been pushed by Bilderberg and the Trilateral Commission and so on. It's all part of that thinking that came out of the Second World War, which is the only way that we are going to achieve the sort of political unity we need is if absolutely everybody in the world is under one government. And the European superstate, as they like to see it, was a massive step on that road. So absolutely, that's what it was.
So when I say superstate, I mean one European government with one economy, one currency, one army, etc., etc., etc. That's sort of the end goal. But you can't just immediately do that. So there had to be all these steps. There has to be all these steps to get the European nations to sort of abandon their own nationality and sovereignty. So I mean that project really started in the 50s. And anyway, by the 1970s. There was, quite a severe economic downturn for Britain, anyway, something like a mini depression, maybe is a bit strong, but certainly a long, prolonged, quite deep recession in the 1970s. I'm speaking with very, very broad strokes to brush here. In the 80s, there was sort of a famous boom, if you like, the classic boom of the 1980s. But by the end of the 1980s, by the very early 1990s, again, there was a bit of a bust cycle, because it always goes in the cycles of boom and bust. So by the 90s, we had the sort of the heyday of the 80s was over, and we had very high interest rates, sort of 10, 11% interest rates, high unemployment, and high interest rates really hurts people trying to pay mortgages or trying to save money, or exports, trying to sell things abroad is very expensive, so people just don't buy
it has
them.
A lot of downsides, but it has positives for some people. So if you are a foreign central bank and you're thinking, okay, let's say you're, I don't know, Kenya or, one of those sort of countries, your own currency is going to be is very variable, not that secure, and you're thinking, I want to hold reserves of some other currency. If you're putting it in sterling, well, sterling is a good brand. It's a very stable thing. And if you're getting 11% interest rates, that's a pretty good level of return for holding a currency in something which is fairly low risk like sterling. So, it did all of those damaging things that you just said to the people in the country,
right,
but it would have helped contribute to quite a strong pound.
Right, yeah, okay. Yeah, so the value of the pound was quite high, though, relatively considering. So, yeah, it might be good for foreign investors or something, or foreign currency speculators. But for Britain, our own internal domestic economy was in really poor shape in the early 90s.
Good for importers because the pound buys you more. Right. Bad for exporters because the exchange rate the other people get is getting as low. But of course, when we import goods, that means somebody else has made them. When we export goods, it's because we've made them. So you want a reasonably strong currency, but you don't want it too strong.
It can certainly be too strong.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely, yeah. Because you just can't really export anything. You can't really sell things abroad. No one's prepared to buy it.
Yeah.
So just very broadly then, they've got the bust of the 70s, the boom of the 80s, and then sort of the bust of the early 90s again. That the economy is sort of in the doldrums, and that certainly our interest rates were very high. So in the Tory party, you've had back then sort of Eurosceptics and sort of pro-Euro
Not
people.
many, to be fair, back then.
Right. They sort of called them wets and dryers.
Yeah.
So Thatcher, though, herself, was sort of famously fairly Eurosceptic. The famous thing where she said, no, to a few different things that Mr. Delors wanted, that the European community sort of insisted we do and wanted from us. And she's just like, no, I'm not doing that. No, that's it. End of discussion sort of thing.
Yeah.
And she didn't want to join the mechanism, the exchange mechanism, and what that is, I suppose, in a nutshell, is that they wanted to peg the main currencies to the Deutschmark. What that means is, instead of having loads of different exchange rates between all the different, because this is pre-Euro, so all the different countries have got their own thing. Italy's still got the lira, Germany's got the Deutschmark, all the countries have got their own currencies. Instead of having, 20, 30 different exchange rates, you peg your currency to the Deutschmark, which is the most stable one. That's what everyone
It's basically a pilot project for the euro, because the euro is everybody has the same currency.
It's one step towards that. Yeah.
And the ERM mechanism was, okay, well, we're not going to have one currency, but we are going to make sure that the currencies are fixed against each other so that they don't move. So it is basically the same thing as having one
within
currency.
A small range, at least.
Yeah, a small range.
Yeah.
So, the underpinnings of the EU project has always been Germany, because it's had the strongest economy. They had a lot of financial discipline because they had been through the Weimar Republic era and they had experienced hyperinflation. And it was seared onto the cultural memory that you must not let inflation get out of control. So they had a very hawkish and very independent central bank. And so they were, at the time, the kind of model for how you do monetary policy. So the rest of the European countries, and also Britain, thought, okay, well, what we're going to do is we are going to have a sort of proxy single currency type arrangement where we are going to make sure that our currency does not move out of too. I mean, you can fluctuate a little bit, but not much away from the Deutschmark. So it's very much the pilot project for the euro.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's sort of some economists, because I'm not a true economist in any sense, but true economists say it's sort of an absolutely necessary first step before you go into a single currency.
I mean, one of the big takeaways from this whole thing that we're talking about now is that the pilot project was a failure.
Right,
and yet they decided, the pilot project was a failure. Let's do the euro anyway.
Yeah. And you remember when Germany screwed over Greece in the last few years? Remember that, when Greece looked like they were going to default, and Germany was like, well, we'll lend you all this money, but you'll have to be our, economically speaking, our bitch forever now.
Yeah, I mean, what they did,
and you've got no choice. How about that?
I mean,
it's like,
no wonder so many Greek people are leaving.
Who wants that?
They have been
epically
country screwed over by Germany.
Who would want that for their country? Yeah. Well, we get screwed over. Italy gets screwed over by Germany in this story.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.